Yeah, thank you very much for being invited. Let me say one thing first. I will be critical about the euro, but I'm an enthusiast about European integration. And I think the EU project was a major success story for Europe, no doubt. The euro is seen by some people as a goal. That I find a mistake. It's an instrument. And the question is, did it contribute to European integration or not? And will it in the future? Unfortunately, it has not contributed. These pictures we have seen during the crisis, and these were the most ugly pictures which I have seen in my life in Western Europe. They went deep into the heart, I can tell you. So the big peace project as which the euro was announced obviously did not come out. We don't have the opposite, we don't have war, but a peaceful development that brings the peoples of Europe closer to one another should have looked different. I was given this topic, how to solve Europe's long-term growth crisis and how to save the euro. It is very difficult to combine these two and achieve both of them simultaneously. And I re-emphasize the euro can only be an instrument. I don't want to get rid of the euro. I think the euro has a potential future, but not the way it's constructed now. And this is the book which was already mentioned. It came out this summer in August by Oxford University Press. Among the things which I've written in my life, I think this required much more effort than anything else which I've done in my life. Let's look at the growth performance. From the year 2000 onwards, China, the graph is too small to show it, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asian countries, Middle East and North Africa, the whole world, on average, 64% growth from 2000 until the end of last year. Emerging and developing countries, Latin America, South Africa, United States, EU 28, Euro area, 14%. And confront that with the Lisbon agenda, Europe will be the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. That's what was said in the year 2000 and was a forecast for 2010. Dream and reality could not be further apart. Now Europe is in shambles. My own country had its own euro crisis 10 years ago, little noticed outside Germany. Germany is depicted as the winner of the euro, which I find absurd. We had a mass unemployment, not because of the euro, but during the initial years of the euro. Now it's much better, but look at other countries. This is France. France 10 years ago had much less unemployment than Germany. Now it has more than twice the German rate of unemployment. This is Ireland. A similar figure has improved. I will explain that. Italy is giving rise to a growing concern. Portugal, the worst could be over, but the absolute numbers are large. And here we have Spain and Greece, both in the order of 25% rate of unemployment. That's what some industrial countries had in the Great Depression at the end of the 20s. Youth unemployment figures even more extreme. For comparison, Germany, France, Ireland, Italy, 44% youth unemployment. Greece and Spain, more than 50% youth unemployment. These are catastrophic developments. It's simply not possible to find semantics to sell, as the first speaker said this morning, the achievements better. I think rather than trying to sell things better, we have to make them better. Industrial production, again, for comparison, Germany, you see the point here, that's the beginning of 2008, before the crisis. Then came the deep fall. You see Germany just by now managed to reach the pre-crisis level. Let's look now at some other European Euro countries. Ireland is a surprising success story. Since last year, the Irish industrial output increased by 20%, an enormous boom. This is Portugal, 10% decline relative to the pre-crisis level. This is France, about 28% decline. And it's a sideward movement, which is giving rise to major concern in France. And this is Italy. Italy has a triple dip recession. The ball fell down here when the crisis came, then in 2009, 2010, Italy seemed to recover. In 2011, there was a further decline. 2011 was the year when Silvio Berlusconi had secret negotiations about the exit of Italy, which led to his own exit. It was the same time when Papandreou had similar ideas. He wanted to have a referendum about austerity in case it would fail. He would also have asked the people to exit. And also Papandreou had to resign. They both resigned within 3 days difference. These things, the backgrounds, are well described in this book by Simeon Janko, the former finance minister of Bulgaria, in his book Inside the Euro Crisis. There you see all these things. Also Bini Smagi is very informative about what really happened behind the curtain in these periods. Okay, then came 2013. Last year, it seemed the crisis was over. The newspapers were forgetting about it. And now Italy, here in 2014, that's the first half year, is already slightly declining. And the forecast is there will be a rather substantial decline. Also, the GDP will decline. Italy, again, is in a recession. It's a triple dip recession. And this is Spain. In Spain, it's not even a recession, it's a depression. Because from here to here, they came down by 30%. Yes, last year, there was a little bit of upswing. Whether it's sustainable, I doubt, because now the whole economic climate in Europe, including Germany, everywhere, is sharply cooling down. We are revising our forecasts every second month downward. So that could even become a triple dip depression. Oops. And here we have, here we have Greece. Greece is now added. It's like Spain. Greece and Spain are much more similar than the impression a tourist who visits these countries might get. Now, what we try against that is demand management, Keynesian borrowing and spending. And the countries in difficulties want to have more time to satisfy their budget goals and so on. And we have an extremely loose monetary policy pouring money at the economy, hoping that this is a solution. I doubt that this is a solution because we don't have a Keynesian lack of demand. The crisis is of a completely different nature. It has nothing to do with a normal business slowdown, wrong beliefs, wrong equilibrium, and all that stuff, what you could give as an argument for Keynesian policies. There's a wrong diagnosis on which the ECB and European policymakers act, and therefore they come up with the wrong therapy. So these are my topics. The bursting bubble, so what really happened, the competitiveness problem, the rescue operations, and my policy proposals. Concerning the bursting bubble, you have probably seen this figure which shows the divergence of interest rates. These are government bonds, but the same in the private sector. Here at the lower end you always have Germany, and here we have Spain, Italy, and other countries. In 1995 there was about 5 percentage points difference. And this difference disappeared until this point in time. That was May 1998, when the exchange rates were irrevocably fixed for the entry into the euro. And it all began here in December 1995 at the Madrid summit, when the alternate timing for the introduction of the euro was specified. Every day we were approaching this point in time, the exchange rate risk was reduced, and so the investors satisfied themselves with lower and lower interest spreads. One country I have to add, this is Greece. Greece entered later with fake numbers. According to Eurostat, they deliberately falsified their data and entered in 2001, and when that became clear, the interest rates also converged. This was a period when everything seemed to function. Wonderful period with low rates of interest, and the temptation was large to continue borrowing more. In Greece, the government sector borrowed abroad to finance higher wages for government employees. In Spain, private people borrowed from their banks, and they borrowed abroad in order to finance real estate purchases. So there was a construction boom. Wages of construction workers increased, basically credit financed. It did not matter how the foreign credit entered these economies, via the government sector or via the private sector, because the respective other sector was automatically affected. We had credit-financed wage increases beyond productivity increases, and this led to sharp inflation. The price levels of these countries increased relative to the rest of the Eurozone and deprived these countries of their competitiveness. Then came the big crisis. The American crisis swept over to Europe because European banks had lost equity. They became nervous about investments in Europe, asked for high interest spreads, and the euro seemed to explode. But then here in the summer of 2012, there was the whatever it takes by the ECB, there was the rescue program, ESM, and so on, and that calmed the markets. But see here now, we have a little uncertainty again about the last few weeks about Greece. The interest rates went up to 9% again. The property prices show exactly this development. Here you see Ireland. They went up from 20 at the time of the Maastricht Treaty to 100. The point is the beginning of the crisis, again, Lehman year. And then we had a 50% decline, a bubble that burst. The same in Spain. A bubble, a housing bubble, financed with a cheap credit that burst. Or here in Greece, everywhere the same story. Cyprus, a little delayed. This is Italy, not as much bubble as elsewhere, not this immediate bursting, but now we have declining prices. We have had them for 2 years in Italy. And this is France, which is surprising for me. For me, this is a bubble that has not yet burst. We can discuss why this is the case. This is Portugal, has also not really burst, but the development has slowed down. And this is my country, Germany. Unfortunately, we don't have longer data here, but what you see is we had slightly declining prices, while elsewhere there was the bubble. And now, after the crisis broke out, it's just the reverse. Everywhere the prices go down, and in Germany we now have increasing house prices. Where does it come from? Well, everything is driven by capital flows. When the capital went to Southern Europe, it financed the boom there. Then came the crisis. Investors shied away from Southern Europe because they were afraid that they would not get their money back and looked for safe haven investment in Germany, bought real estate. So the German bubble is the result of the crisis. Are we now on the right track? Since last year, the communication departments of the governments and of Brussels have produced a flood of information that seems to signal that everything is over. Well, there are indicators showing that. This is the current account balance of the 6 crisis countries, those who received help from the others. Not program countries necessarily, but if I include the ECB help, then we have Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Cyprus. 6 countries. Their current account deficit went to more than 200,000. That was at the time of the Lehman crisis. But since then, things have improved enormously, and we are now on the plus side. That has been interpreted as a sign that competitiveness has been regained. But it's not as simple as that, because the interest relief which the ECB's actions and the cheap credit through the rescue operations provided in itself have contributed 72 billion euros per year to the current account. Without that, we would not be at plus 36, but at minus 36. Many people overlook that the current account is not just exports and imports, but also the interest payments on the net foreign debt is part of the accounting. But now let's look at the exports and imports separately. Just for 2 countries, I can promise you it's for all of them equal, more or less. I take 2 extremes, Greece and Spain. Greek exports, yes, they have recovered after the decline in 2008, 2009. Everything declined in the world at that period. But since then, they have recovered. But they are not back on their pre-crisis trend. An enormous movement we see here with imports. The imports left their trend and collapsed, and that has improved the Greek current account. It is the collapse of the economy which is behind it. If you have a mass unemployment, you don't have the money to buy Korean flat TVs. It's as simple as that. It has nothing to do with an improvement in competitiveness. Let's now look at Spain. Here the export performance is much better. The Spanish exports have succeeded in reaching their pre-crisis trend, but the dynamism of the current account, obviously also here, comes from the import side. The imports have collapsed, and they are now less than the exports. So it's an income effect rather than a substitution effect, which is mainly behind this. The problem is the lack of competitiveness in Southern Europe. In 1995, everything seemed so fine. You know, you got lower interest rates. That was actually the main driving motive for getting into the euro. Many countries were at the brink of maybe not bankruptcy, but major financial difficulties at the time. And the euro promised them low interest rates. For Italy, the advantage of lower interest rates gave them a relief in the government budget, which was more than their total value-added tax revenue. Just to give you an idea how important the interest reduction was. So everything seemed fine until 10 years later, in the midst of the first decade of the century, when the Eastern European countries suddenly joined. And these were all have-nots. Low-wage earners, and they attracted a lot of direct investment. Here you see the labor cost per hour for these countries in manufacturing. And here you see the respective costs for the 6 crisis countries. Compare Poland with Greece. You see that Poland has a wage which is half of that in Greece. The Greek people would have to be twice as productive as the Polish if this is to be compatible with a competitive equilibrium. I tell you, they are not half as productive as the Poles. And here we have a comparison between Poland and Spain. Spain's wages are more than 3 times as high as the Polish ones. Nothing what politicians in Brussels, in Berlin, or elsewhere might write on paper, no directive, no specification, will be able to make a contribution to this problem. This is completely meaningless. The economic forces which are operating through the wage cost differences will play out over the next few decades in Europe until Europe will have found roughly its new equilibrium. This is not a political thing. Politicians are completely powerless. Another view on the same problem, let's look at prices. Because ultimately what matters is prices. Prices result from productivity and from wages. Any country in the world can be competitive, even the least productive country in Africa, if their living standard follows the productivity. Lack of competitiveness always results from the attempt to have a living standard beyond productivity, because then you're too expensive. So we have to look at the prices. This is the so-called real exchange rates. That's the GDP deflator, as published by Eurostat, relative for various countries, relative to the respective rest of the Eurozone. It's not the consumer price index. That doesn't matter because it includes imports. It's the price index of their self-produced goods. Here is Spain. It's normalized such that this point for all countries is 100 at the time of Lehman. They went up from 80 to 100 from the Madrid summit to the outbreak of the crisis. So that means it's a 25% real appreciation, as if they had their peseta and appreciated the value of the peseta by 25%. That is what has happened for Spain. When Germany, in the Bretton Woods system in 1961, had an appreciation of 5%, the German industry was claiming that, was warning that they would all go under because of the 5% appreciation. This was sustainable as long as the private credit was flowing to finance the resulting current account deficit, but when it stopped, there was a problem. Now Spain has to take the back gear. They were too expensive, they became too expensive, and now they have to become cheaper. Yes, they do it. During the crisis, they have devalued by 6%, by inflating less than the other European countries. Cutting their wages, they did some enormous effort, cutting their prices a little bit, so it helped. But is that enough? I doubt that it is enough. They would have to return to this level. And if we ask the question, where would they have to go in order to service their foreign debt in the long run? Then they would have to go even further down, because they built up an enormous stock of foreign debt. The net foreign debt of Spain is 1,000 billion, roughly, which is as big as the net foreign debt of all other crisis countries together. So they need a further devaluation for that. And the economics department of Goldman Sachs has done a very nice study which gives you this figure. It's 34% relative to the rest of the Eurozone, or another way of expressing it, not to get confused, it's 30% relative to the average of the Eurozone. There are these two kinds of numbers, one always confuses them. But since the Eurostat numbers are always with regard to the rest of the Eurozone, I recalculated them to be compatible with this graph. Yes, they are on the right way, but it's a long, long way. An older colleague of mine who had studied the Bretton Woods period said realignment, a major realignment in a fixed currency setting needs 1 generation. To give you an idea of the kinds of problems we are facing. Here we have Greece. A similar thing. They also devalued exactly by 3%, only the last 2 years. And this is where they have to go. And this is Portugal, similar story. This is Italy. Italy, surprisingly for me in these calculations, just has to come down by 11%. I'm not sure whether that calculation is right, but I just report it. And here we have France. France, surprisingly also, did not inflate more than the rest of the Eurozone. The curve was flat, but France is nevertheless building up an increasing current account deficit, and in order to have debt sustainability in the long run, they would have to devalue by 20% against the average, 24% against the rest of the Eurozone. We discussed this number yesterday. And this is Germany. That's the bad guy, because German deflation in relative terms is another way of expressing the same phenomenon, driving these other countries into a situation of losing competitiveness. But Germany did not deflate. It just had low inflation, in line with the Maastricht Treaty, while the other countries all inflated way above the 2% limit which the ECB had specified. So in order to bring the whole thing into an equilibrium, Germany would have to go up by 30%, the others to go down by 30%. Then we are roughly there. And that will be a long period of time. Here is my last country. This is Ireland. Ireland devalued enormously. From here, 2006 to here, 15%. This is the only country that did the real devaluation. And why did they do that? Why Ireland? Why not the others? Well, first of all, they have an American labor market with weak unions. And second, no one was helping them. That's my interpretation. In 2006, they were standing alone. There was no time being given by some European institution to do their reforms. No one was helping them. They were standing alone. They were tightening their belt, cutting their wages, and reducing their prices. And it helped. You remember, industrial production in Ireland was stable and even increased during the last year. A big success story. There are four dismal options now. Coming from a dismal science, it is appropriate that I speak about dismal options. The first is we create a transfer union and finance the lack of competitiveness with ongoing transfers from the north to the south. But this will become expensive because then 40% of the Eurozone will have to finance by 60%. The German transfer union, which did not succeed actually, meant 80-20. That was much easier. And this comes on top of that. I think it's impossible even to dream of a transfer solution in that order of magnitude in Europe. Above that, the countries that would receive the transfers would be kept in a permanent situation of Dutch disease. What do I have here? When Holland found gas, the sales of gas allowed wage increases, which destroyed the export industry. And only when the gas was out could the industry recover. East Germany is in such a Dutch disease. Its GDP per capita is 66% of West Germany, if you take the old boundaries. And without the artificial wage increase in the government sector, it would just be 63%. No convergence since 1995 anymore. West Germany has grown by 27%, East Germany by 20% over that period. Southern Italy has been in a Dutch disease situation for a very long period of time. So that's really a dismal option. Second, we deflate the periphery through austerity. Austerity means there is no artificial demand from the printing press or from borrowing, and there is a mass unemployment. And there are lots of insolvencies, and that limits the possibilities to deflate. Yes, Ireland showed there is a little bit of deflation possible, but for the southern European countries, the path towards equilibrium is longer. Don't forget, these countries came into trouble by borrowing too much. So the typical household, the typical firm is over-indebted. They have their debt service. If you just cut their wages in half, they will not be able to service their debt. They will be bankrupt. And you would have to fight down the unions. That could be a bloody exercise. It is not really possible to go that way. Germany deflated in relative terms from 1929 to 33 by 23%. That was the price cut, because the reparations were had to be paid in non-devaluated Reichsmark. Germany could not devalue, unlike Britain, for example, which did so in 31. And the result was shooting in the streets. The hordes from the left and the right were having war in the streets. We were at the brink of a civil war as a result of such a strategy. Okay, what else? Inflating the core. I showed you, Germany goes up, the others go down. We could do the whole thing by Germany going up even more with the price level and no one going down. How far would it have to go up? By 70%. 70% inflation over 10 years of time would be 5.5% per year, and the average Eurozone inflation rate would be 3.6%, which would not be compatible with the EU mandate. And apart from that, how do you generate inflation if you wish so? If the rate of interest is already zero, the powder could be used up. Fourth, we exit. Those countries for whom the path is too long, they exit, devalue their new old currency. But that's a mess, because once you begin to talk about it, there will be a capital flight, there will be bank runs, the banks would immediately be driven to the brink of insolvency, and in order to stop that from happening, you need capital controls of the Cypriot type. Exactly what we have done in Cyprus. We have now 2 euros in the Eurozone, one in prison in Cyprus and one in freedom in other European countries. The exchange rate is not 1 to 1, it's 0.8 on average to 1. So there are only ugly options. There is no clear solution. If someone makes a proposal what to do, you can easily point out the terrors and horrors which whatever he proposes would bring about. Any trained economist would be able to show that about any proposal to be made. For the time being, we have chosen the first path. Europe is moving towards a transfer union. By having huge public credit flows, which have been organized, replacing the missing private capital flows. And these public capital flows will, over time, turn into outright transfers. First, we reduce the interest rates towards zero, then we extend the maturities to infinity, and then we more or less are already at transfers. You can call it credit, but in economic terms, it's already a transfer. At some stage in history, one will just wipe it off and say, okay, we continue with transfers. The biggest transfer operation of that sort came from the local printing presses. The ECB has done the job. When the southern European countries and Ireland could not borrow anymore, they printed the money which they needed. And this was made possible through the collateral policy of the ECB. If a commercial bank wants to borrow from its central bank, it has to hand in good assets as collateral, and only then will it receive the newly printed money as credit. Until October 2008, the collateral requirement was A. But it soon turned out that this was not enough. Banks did not have enough good assets for that standard. So the ECB reduced the collateral requirements for many assets to BBB, which is already very low. And then they stepwise reduced the collateral requirement for the government bonds of Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, which banks had acquired and handed into their central banks as collateral, to less than BBB minus. BBB minus is the lowest investment rank, though. So it implies they accepted investment trash. When the rating agency said this is no longer investment grade, the ECB said we don't care. Come on, give it to me, and we accept it. Actually, it's much more complicated than this short list in my book. I have a whole chapter on the collateral policy that was the most difficult chapter of all. A myriad of single decisions. And then non-traded ABS papers of banks were allowed. Banks could bundle their credit claims, and here shortly before the trash level of the ECB stopped with BBB minus. These are the papers which they now the other day decided to buy. And then there was ELA credit. ELA credit is a credit which is supposed to be for emergency, but the local central bank can define its own collateral policy, regardless of what the ECB does, with the fiction that it is liable for any losses. As you know, Cyprus, for example, that went through the newspapers a few weeks ago, printed half a GDP in 2012, 9 billion euros as ELA credit, giving it to the banks to allow the Russian oligarchs to escape, and the investors from London and the investors from Athens. So it was a postponement of insolvency. It's a legal term for 1 year, and during this 1 year the most important investors were able to escape, until the ECB then finally put an end to this. A bailout with the printing press. The bailout of the creditors, the debtors and their creditors. First of all, French banks, they were the largest creditors, then the German banks, then the British banks, and then many others from the whole world. You can imagine that the financial industry was more than happy about what happened, because their wealth portfolios were rescued. Not only the southern countries were happy, but the financial industry throughout the world. Just read The Economist when you want to know how they find this policy. What happened was extreme. 100% is the total monetary base in the Eurozone. That is all the central bank money circulating somewhere. This is that part of that monetary base circulating in our 6 crisis countries, GIPSIC I call them, so it's a quarter or so now. And the rest is the money circulating outside these countries elsewhere. And this is the money made in the 6 crisis countries, made in terms of credit operations by their local central banks. This difference here is money made in the south and circulating in the north, made for the purpose of continuing to buy goods in the north or redeeming the private debt in the north, allowing the investors to escape back home. I call this outside money, using an old term by Gurley and Shaw, for opposite to inside money. The rest of the money not circulating in the crisis countries is inside money because it came out of credit operations there. This, at the peak here in summer 2012, was 57% of the entire monetary base, or 1,002 billion euros rescue credit from the printing press. It's measured by the so-called target balances, because they measure the net money being cabled through payment orders from one country to another. For Germany, to give you an idea what that implied, it was extreme. This is the entire monetary base circulating in Germany, and this is the money made by the Bundesbank. And you see, from the summer 2012 onwards, there was not a single cent in Germany made in Germany. Made in the sense of credit operations. Made in the sense of carrying out a payment order, yes, of course, by the Bundesbank. But the Bundesbank received not a claim against the private banking sector, as it usually would if it issues money, but a claim against the ECB system, which itself received a claim against the central banks of the printing countries, and they received a claim against their banks. The credit was already issued there. We don't have a settlement system in Europe, unlike America. America, until 1975, between the 13 districts of the Fed, had a gold settlement. So if one central bank had to carry out the payment orders for another, therefore giving it implicitly a credit, it had the right to be settled, to be redeemed with gold. And now it's no longer gold, it's property shares in the so-called SOMA portfolio. There was an intervention spiral. The euro caused a credit bubble. Then, when the private credit didn't flow anymore, the countries were printing the money they couldn't borrow against reduced collateral. Then the ECB saw the value of the collateral falling and bought the collateral, SMP program. Then the government said, you cannot do that, that's forbidden by the Maastricht Treaty. If someone buys these government bonds, it's us and not you. That was the rescue programs, EFSF, ESM, and so on. Then the ECB said, fine, what you do, but it's not enough for the markets. The markets need more money. So that was the OMT program, the announcement to buy back from investors the government bonds, taking the risk away from them. Then came the banking union, and now come the ABS purchases, which is basically the same logic as the SMP program. The ECB buys now the collateral which the banks had handed in order to preserve this ongoing credit operations. If we click through here and see the total, in August 2012, for 1,339 billion euros was extra credit being given to the 6 crisis countries, of which 17% was controlled by the parliaments of Europe and 83% by the ECB Council. A technocratic body which was supposed to make monetary policy. They all claim it's monetary policy. I think it's much more, it's a fiscal, regional bailout policy which was carried out. And that's a major democracy problem for Europe. The capital market has been calmed by shifting the risk from investors to taxpayers, who are the silent owners of the ECB. But that undermines the allocative role of the capital market. And it is a legal problem insofar as the purchase of government bonds, or the announcement of that, is not allowed by the Maastricht Treaty. That's the case with the German Constitutional Court. And let me come back to why the growth performance was so bad in Europe. I think it was so bad because the euro channeled lots of capital movements from the north to the south, creating artificial safety for investors. The money was eaten up in countries like Greece, in the government sector for wages, and it was invested partly in dubious real estate projects, which are now standing idle. So the money was largely wasted, rather than being invested in an efficient way. And that has deprived Europe of its growth chances in the first 10 years of the euro. And what the public rescue operations imply is that we will have at least another 10 years of that sort, because the investors have understood their mistake and said, we don't want to continue investing in these, for these debtors. But now the ECB says, and the EU institutions, well, we don't want you to stop, you have to continue investing where you don't want to invest. So it's a big investment steering project, what we are having. Again, channeling lots of savings from the north to the south into the same largely inefficient investment uses. And that will cost us another decade of growth at least. My policy proposals are radical. 3 basic measures to rescue the euro and the EU, because if we continue, we may destroy everything. First is we need a big debt conference to forgive part of the public debt, the bank debt, and the target debt built up in Southern Europe. It makes no sense not to see the truth in the face. We have to accept they won't repay, and putting the interest rate to 0 to solve it is not a solution. Then the creditors won't get their money back either. So it is better to really make a haircut and say, now you have a debt which you really can service, and the rest we forgive. Second, we need temporary exits from the Eurozone. Rather than having a system where you just can enter and never exit, which I would call a prison, you have a possibility of temporarily being in, then getting out. If we have rules, there won't be a catastrophe. Now there might be a catastrophe if we don't specify the rules. And if a country can't survive in the euro, then the spreads will go up in time, then the country will have enough signal to behave, or if not, will be able to prepare for the exit. And then after having exited and devalued, they can return at a later point in time. I would even keep them legally in. They could legally stay part of the Eurozone while exiting. And then we need a system of harder local budget constraints. It is impossible, in my opinion, to have a system where you can just print money on demand. If you can't borrow anymore, or the conditions of the markets don't please you, you print the money and lend it out to your local banks, which you don't want to borrow. It is impossible to allow a country to print half a GDP in 1 year as extra credit, as in the case of Cyprus. Just copy the American rules, then we would be fine. In the end, I insist we have to continue the European integration process and create a European confederation. Last year we issued a report where we advocate following the Swiss confederation model for Europe. I don't want to go into the details, but what I find essential is that we do everything in right sequence. I find it incredible that we want to continue this path of European integration while we still have separate armies. How can that be? We socialize and mutualize everything, and we have separate armies with separate commands. That is the European idea? Sorry, I don't buy that. Switzerland and the United States first developed for military reasons. They first created a strong political center with a military power, and then came the fiscal development thereafter. In Europe, we tried to do it completely different, and here I look to my French colleague. The French do not want that. And here we have to nail them down whether you really want European integration or not. I take it serious, because we cannot just mutualize all the money without doing the decisive steps first. Debt mutualization should not occur in a confederation. There are two models for a federation. First, we have debt mutualization. The spreads are artificially reduced because we create investor safety. and then we impose political constraints so that the countries do not abuse that by overborrowing. Fiscal compact, stability and growth compact, and what have you. That's the one model, the European model. It failed because Renzi and Valls basically declined this idea. And the other possibility is we have a liability model. We allow for local bankruptcies and bail-ins. A bankruptcy means that the investor knows he possibly does not get his money back. And therefore, he's very careful with lending. He doesn't lend too much money in the first place. And if so, at high interest rates. And these high interest rates discourage overborrowing. This is the model of the United States. California is close to bankruptcy. They pay their teachers with IOUs. No one even discusses in America helping bailing out California. The Fed would not buy a single Californian government bond. Unlike the ECB, the Fed does not buy government bonds, let alone from states in crisis. And that system works. The same in Switzerland. That has given stability. The United States did have initially a different model. They had tried the mutualization model. This is Alexander Hamilton, my last slide. Alexander Hamilton was the first finance minister of the United States. In 1791, he mutualized the state debt, arguing that this mutualization would be cement for the new American state. Then there was a second round of mutualization in 1813 in the Second War against Britain. And the idea then was among the states, oh, you can borrow, no problem, because the debt burden will be shifted to the federal level. So the states borrowed like hell, built canals, roads. There was a credit bubble. The bubble burst in 1837, and from 1837 to 42, 9 out of 29 American states and territories went bust. Nothing but hassle and strife was the result of debt mutualization. Harold James, historian from Princeton University, argued the fiscal union proved to be explosive rather than cement, as Hamilton had thought. And he draws a direct line from the unresolved debt problem to the War of Secession, arguing that while it was mainly caused by the slavery problem, the unresolved debt problem had contributed to the tensions. Only after the War of Secession did it become clear in America that the mutualization model would not work. You needed liability as the fundamental stability principle for a confederation. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we should mimic the American system as it is today, and then we have a prosperous future for Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.